The camera flickered to life, adjusting to the dim glow of a quiet studio. The backdrop was minimalist, no flashy graphics, no distractions. Just 2 chairs, a table, and the weight of the moment settling in the air. Across from the legendary Steve Jobs sat Walter Isaacson, the biographer who had spent years chronicling Jobs' life. This wasn't just any interview, this was Jobs' last recorded conversation before stepping away from the public eye. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Walter leaned forward, his hands clasped. Steve, you've revolutionized technology. You built one of the most valuable companies in the world. But I have to ask, was it worth it? Jobs exhaled, slowly, adjusting his black turtleneck. His once fiery energy had softened, but his presence remained commanding. Define worth it, he said. Walter didn't hesitate. You made Apple an empire, but at what cost? The audience held their breath. Jobs looked past the camera, as if seeing something the rest of the world couldn't. Then, finally, he spoke. Success is easy to measure, he said. Fulfillment isn't. The words hit like a shockwave. Are you saying you're not fulfilled? Jobs smirked, a knowing, almost sad smile. I'll put it this way, he said. Dreams have a cost. Sometimes it's higher than you expect. The silence that followed was deafening, and at that moment, the world had no idea just how deep this conversation would go. The weight of Steve Jobs' words lingered in the studio air. Walter Isaacson sat back, momentarily caught off guard. Walter leaned in. You said dreams have a cost. What did yours cost you? Jobs exhaled, rubbing his fingers together, a familiar habit when he was deep in thought. Time, he said, with my family, my friends, my health. The audience went silent. This wasn't the confident, sharp-edged CEO people were used to. This was Steve Jobs, the man, not the icon. I spent years chasing perfection, Jobs continued. Every product, every launch, every detail. I built something lasting, but in doing so, I missed moments I can't get back. Walter hesitated before asking, Do you regret it? Jobs gave a small, tired smile. Regret is a funny thing. Would I trade Apple's success for more time with my kids? Absolutely. But if I had chosen differently, would I still be the man I am today? A long pause. Then, for the first time in the interview, Jobs looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, ask yourself, what are you sacrificing? And is it worth it? The world wasn't ready for what came next. The studio was dead silent. Walter Isaacson shifted in his seat, processing the weight of Jobs' words. Walter hesitated before asking, Steve, after everything, after all the success, the failures, the sacrifices, what do you want to be remembered for? Jobs' lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced downward, as if weighing his answer carefully. I used to think legacy was about products, he said finally, about what you create, what you build, what you leave behind. He let the words settle before continuing. But now, Jobs exhaled. Now, I think legacy is about people. The lives you change, the ideas you inspire, the courage you give, someone to take their own first step. Walter nodded slowly. So, what do you hope people remember about you? A flicker of amusement crossed Jobs' face. That I never settled. That I questioned everything. That I pushed others not to be like me, but to think differently. Another pause. Then Jobs leaned forward, locking eyes with Walter. But most of all, I hope people remember that they don't need to be like me at all. Walter blinked. What do you mean? Jobs smiled. That they don't need to wait for permission. They don't need to follow a blueprint. They just need to start. A slow murmur rippled through the audience. People weren't just listening anymore. They were feeling every word. But Steve Jobs wasn't done yet, because what he said next would become the most unforgettable moment of the interview. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Steve Jobs sat still, his fingers resting lightly on the arm of his chair. The audience barely breathed, waiting, knowing they were about to hear something unforgettable. Walter Isaacson swallowed, steadying his voice. Steve, if this were your last interview, your last chance to say something to the world, what would you say? Jobs exhaled softly. He sat back, looking past the cameras, past the audience, as if seeing something they couldn't. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he spoke. I spent my life chasing perfection, building, creating, pushing. But in the end, none of it matters as much as the time you have left, and who you spend it with. Walter didn't speak. Neither did the crowd. Jobs glanced at his hands. We measure success in wealth, in achievements, in what we build. But time is the only thing you can't buy back. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Then Jobs looked up, his gaze sharper. So if you're watching this, stop waiting. Stop waiting for the perfect idea, the perfect moment, the perfect life. Create, risk, love, fail. Try again. Because the only guarantee is that one day you won't have another chance. A woman in the audience wiped away a tear. Even Ethan looked shaken. Jobs gave a small smile, but there was no regret behind it. Only clarity. Stay hungry. Stay foolish. Silence. Then applause. Thunderous. Emotional. Because in that moment, it wasn't just an interview. It was a lesson. A final lesson from one of the greatest minds of the modern age. And when the cameras cut, Steve Jobs stood, shook Walter's hand, and walked away. What no one knew at the time was that this would be the last recorded message from him before he passed. And those words, they would live forever. If you had one final message to share with the world, what would it be? Drop a comment below. And if you believe in the power of wisdom, subscribe now, because tomorrow we have another story you won't want to miss.